guys again. Welcome to 20th Century Music Part 2. So now we'll be exploring sort of the progression of jazz. It's coming from the 1920s and forward. So after we sort of talked about having the development of blues, the influence of blues, so these jazz guys were using blues, that format, and a lot of the sort of the improv and all that stuff similarly. But again, if you were just to make a differentiation, first of all, between the jazz and the blues, is a lot of it really is, I think, rhythmically. So you're going to have, again, that swing feeling, which you do sometimes have in blues. I'm not saying you don't, but a lot of that is it's more consistent in the traditional jazz format. Also, jazz musicians don't exclusively just use blues, the blues, to 12-bar blues to solo over and stuff. They started, use different sort of, song forms to solo over. And as jazz had progressed, these things got more and more complicated. But let's begin here in the 1920s as jazz is really starting to come on its own. And we start to see in your book, you'll see the New Orleans style, or Dixieland jazz, or some people call early jazz, which is really, again, the sort of epicenter of jazz at this time, which was New Orleans, which was a melting pot of different, you might have learned history of that term, the melting pot. It's had a lot of different sort of cultural influences coming in, it's, Cajun or European, American, and so forth. And the biggest sort of figure that comes out of this period, and Jelly Roll Morton, of course, is one of them too, but it was Louis Armstrong, or Satchmo, who was a trumpeter and singer from this period, who was, by the 1930s, a national celebrity. In the early goings, you're going to hear one of the examples, first of all, the New Orleans style, are very small bands. First of all, they're not these really big band jazz. You just had maybe like 4 or 5 or 7, up to 7 maybe people in a band. And you can see a picture on 4, 7, and 9 in your book. 4, 7, yeah. Sort of typical line where you have maybe a trumpet player, a trombone player, a clarinet. You might have a guitarist, pianist, drummer, bass, these sort of things. Typical instruments. And one of the things here you get to see an example of with Louis Armstrong. First of all, Louis Armstrong was really an unbelievable improviser, and an amazing rhythmic player, and especially when you think about where these guys are coming from. If you listen to enough early jazz, he's just so much better than anybody else, and you have to consider there really wasn't much before him, so which made him such a unique individual. And he was just, like I said, it was a character, and like I said, became a very big celebrity as jazz grew. What we're going to be hearing here is from Armstrong, was Hotter Than That, which is a group, as an example from something from his group, the Hot Fives. Again, what's one of the things you're going to notice in a lot of this early jazz, one thing is a lot of collective improvisation. So that means, like in here, for example, here the song starts out with everybody improvising simultaneously, which is sort of a big part of it, and then you'll go through a series of solos. So a typical jazz tune. And this one's a little bit different because of the collective improv, part of it. But is that you're going to basically have what musicians call a head. So you're just going to have the melody. If someone's going to play a melody, and then the chords behind it, those sort of homophonic, as we remembered from the first part of our semester. And then after that is stated, each one of the musicians will go ahead and take a sort of, a guitar, a solo. So, okay, it's your turn to take a solo, and your turn to take a solo. So everyone will go through a solo, improvising. And then at the end of the piece, they'll return to that we call the head, or the melody of the tune, and that'll be the end of it. So that's typical. And you'll sort of see that sort of development here at this. And then this is not a blues tune. This is considered a 32-bar form. So instead of just 12 measures that are just repeated, this is 32, so it's longer. But everybody gets that same thing. And what you're going to also see is an example of Louis doing his scat singing, which is sort of these nonsensical, da do da 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 do, it's just rhythmic singing without any real words. So this is sort of an excellent example of sort of early jazz, or Dixieland, New Orleans style, what have you. By the 1930s and 40s, jazz had really kicked into high gear and really started to develop a lot, both in popularity and sort of aesthetically. And you start to see what we call the big band era, or the swing era. And a lot of these big bands were, flooding the dance floors and doing the, having these very lavish arrangements. So you can see a picture from our hook here, Benny Goodman's band. You could see, everyone's out in suits. The arrangements of the music is very polished, very organized. It's great stuff. And I'd given you a few different examples. Begin to Begin, some Duke Ellington. Duke was among the biggest names. We covered a little bit when we first started the class. So these guys are some of the biggest. Count Basie, who's here from Red Bank, New Jersey, another one, that were very important figures for development of jazz, and they still had Cat had a swing feel, and they were it just was a much bigger sound, and they still improvised and things like that. So that was really a big part of things, is this sort of swing era. But in the 1940s, there was a development in jazz called bebop. And sort of the background of bebop is, it's kind of coming, it was sort of a response to the swing era bands, because, there's a thing, it's an old saying, with popularity comes imitation. So a lot of these bands, there was a lot, since jazz was so popular, you saw a lot of these pop-ups, dance bands that were coming up, and people would, just take it as entertainment. And, maybe they were a little more watered down to like some of these more, proficient players. So these beboppers is like, look, this isn't really jazz is not meant to be dance music. It's meant to be a serious art form. It's something you go to a jazz show. You're gonna sit there and listen to these guys. So that the beboppers kind of came in, and had just sort of this very hip, way about them. It was like these cool cat kind of things. And what it is these guys were playing music. The bebop music is extremely technically challenging. It's very hard. It's very difficult to solo over. There's a lot of chords. It's just not as free. It doesn't have a lot of freedom to play. So in order to be a good bebop player, like these guys were, you had to be an amazing musician. And the musicians that we cover the most in the bebop here are going to be the big figures are going to be Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Parker, also known as Bird, was an alto sax player, and Gillespie was a trumpet player. And there's a clip, because very, very little, I think that might be the only actual video of Charlie Parker that exists. It might be something else they had found, but basically that's it. But there's a tune, I think I gave you Hot House to listen to, and you can sort of see the typical setup. Again, small groups, focused on improvisation. You have the head, the melody, and then everyone takes a solo. But you'll notice, first of all, the rhythmic difference. The beat's different. So instead of like these early bands where you have like a kicking bass drum or something like that, the actual pulse of the tune is going to be supplied by a cymbal. You'll see him hitting like a ride cymbal, or we call it, or just like a very large cymbal. And then what the drummers will do, will just have these like sort of accented hits on his drums to sort of be sort of responsive to what the improvisers are doing. So it's like, we call it bombs, or you just hear like kind of rhythmic things, that sort of accents happening. So these beboppers were really, again, considered, this is not dance music, this is an art form, and it really is what we consider bebop to be, as the birth of modern jazz. So a lot of the players, things you go see, all this jazz exists now, but it's when you think of jazz now, it sort of has it's sort of format from these guys. And Parker being really the biggest name, probably the biggest name maybe of all jazz, is Charlie Parker. He was a pioneer of the genre, and was a fireball, though. It lived fast, lived hard, had lots of problems with drug and alcohol, and these kinds of things, and died young. But his mark was not. It was certainly left. By the late 40s into the 1950s, you'll start to see some music called cool jazz, or sometimes referred to as modal jazz. And this was a sort of a form where the musicians were like, you know what, we need to focus more on just having more melody and being able to express ourselves more freely without having to be like so over the top trying to figure out how to play through these tunes because they're so hard. So these cool guys sort of stripped things down, and they play maybe songs that had maybe a couple of chords in it, so you can easily solo and be able to express yourself. And had much more of a swinging, chill, laid-back feel. One of the pioneers is, of course, one of my heroes is Miles Davis, who I wrote a book about. Miles was, a young player who had brought up playing with Parker and Gillespie and stuff as a young man, and then went on and sort of pioneered a lot of different sort of subgenres of jazz. So, like one Miles album may not be, could be completely different to a different one. You know, another album down the road, he was constantly evolving his style, and you know, it was sort of definitely a very you know, an influence on, you know, other artists who had worked similarly, like Prince or maybe even Kanye or something, where you don't know what to expect, and that sort of was Miles's thing. And what was interesting about Miles, even though how popular whatever he was doing, he would you know, if he didn't want to play it ever again, he never would, you know, and that's this way. He just was someone who just wanted to progress. But yeah, so he was one of these pioneers in the album. I'll give you a clip of Miles playing a tune called So What to listen to, which is a piece from his album Kind of Blue from 1959, which is the greatest selling jazz album of all time, and it's certainly an essential album to have in your collection. This is very laid back and chill. As the 50s and 60s progressed, you start to get into stuff called like free jazz, which I had given you an excerpt of Ornette Coleman's free jazz, and what these guys were saying was like, look, if anything is written down, it's not as authentic as it should be. Everything should be improvised. There should be no beginning, no end, no key, no nothing. You know what I mean? We call these free jazz or avant-garde, which is just very chaotic. You know, it's just everything's in the moment, and you know, it's sort of everything. Things are kind of left by chance. I wish I had. If you ever seen some people here like a Jackson Pollock painting, where there's all these paint splatters. You know, it's just sort of the same sort of concept. There's actually the album cover of Free Jazz. You can see of Jackson Pollock, where they're just like, you know, we're going to find out what happens now. We're not going to be like, okay, I want to write this out or anything. So the results can be, you know, exhilarating, but at the same time could also be out there. So again, you know, something. Just hear an excerpt of it. You don't have to go sit through a 20-minute piece or something like that. Just a little bit. And finally, about the late 60s. Popularity of jazz had really gone down, so a lot of what was happening, rock music was at its absolute zenith, you know, by then, and so what was popular once no longer really was. So a lot of artists were actually trying to combine sort of the new sounds of like rock or Motown, things of the 60s, into jazz or funk music, and you start to get this new movement called jazz fusion or jazz rock, whereas you have a combination of different things. And I had shown you an example of Miles Davis's Bitches Brew album. That's kind of familiar with the album that I wrote a book on, where you have these sort of elements of rock combined with jazz improv, jazz instruments. So you might have maybe a little more electric stuff or a rock beat, but you'll still have sort of the essence of rock, jazz improv, and you know, has its, you know, swings in its own sort of way. And Bitches Brew was really the pioneering album of it. You know, if you listen to it, it's dense, it's tricky to listen to. The pieces are very long. It sounds anything but commercial. However, this album was one of his most successful albums of his career, and it was eventually went platinum. You know, it was a double album of 25-minute pieces, no vocals. But you know, people really were into it and still do now. And so, you know, it's one of those things. And you know, jazz fusion had sort of waned also by the 70s, and it sort of got watered down. And you know, by the 80s, I think there was more of a movement we call it the Young Lions, where these people are starting to bring traditional acoustic jazz together. And like I said, if you go to a jazz club now, you can see a lot of everything. You know, traditional jazz that's sort of again sort of monikered from bebop is, you know, probably the most common. But you can go see big bands. I know I have friends that do big bands and things like that. So you know, there's a little for everything. You can probably see Dixieland groups, you know, still play. So today, you know, and you know, obviously New York has, you know, once bebop came about, New York became the epicenter of jazz music, and sort of still is today. You know, a lot of these clubs are still in existence, the Blue Note, Village Vanguard, things like that. So that's our summary on jazz in the 20th century. And next up, so start listening to everything and getting an idea of it, and there's good stuff, you know what I mean? There's interesting music to listen to, and I hope this helps, and then next time we'll do some rock. All right, good night.